The proximity alarm tore through the command deck before I had even set down my coffee. By the time I looked up, 3 shapes had already crossed our outer marker, moving fast and low, straight toward the convoy we were supposed to be protecting. Skarn Raiders. "Report," I said, already crossing to the tactical display. Nora Bishop didn't look up from her console. 3 raiders confirmed, maybe a 4th hiding in their engine wake, but I can't get a clean read yet. They came out of the debris field near the 4th moon. The convoy is 4 minutes from the jump gate. At this speed, the raiders reach them in 90 seconds. 90 seconds. I had flown 100 drills built around numbers like that, and none of them had ever felt this short. I opened the fleet channel. "Daniel, scramble everything we have. Now." "Already moving," Daniel Pierce answered, and behind his voice I heard the launch alarm sound a half-second later. Daniel had been my second in command for 6 years. In 6 years, he had never once made me repeat an order. Below us, on the flight deck, 12 fighters broke from their bays in a formation so tight it looked rehearsed, because it was. We ran that drill every week. Nobody on this station had ever complained about the extra hours, not even when the Concord auditors called it wasteful spending during last year's budget review. The convoy itself was not ours. 6 cargo haulers loaded with medical supplies and refinery parts, escorted by a single Veth cruiser under a commander named Wren, a careful, correct officer who had never given me a single reason to dislike him and several reasons to worry about him. "Wren, this is Station 7, I said. "We have your raiders on approach. Recommend you pull your escort tight and let my fighters take the intercept line." There was a pause, longer than I liked. "Commander Voss, my cruiser will withdraw to protect the lead hauler. The remaining ships must accept the risk." His orders came from a Concord fleet manual that measured value in cargo tonnage and prioritized flagship assets over everything behind them. It was not cowardice. It was policy, written by people who had never once had to explain an empty hauler to the families waiting for medicine on the other side of that jump gate. I had stopped arguing that particular point with escort commanders years ago. It never changed the manual, and out here, arguing costs seconds nobody has to spare. "Copy that," I said, and switched channels before my voice could carry what I actually thought about it. "Daniel, Wren is pulling back to protect the lead ship. That leaves 5 haulers exposed. I want fighters on all 5. "That's a stretch, Commander. We'll be thin." "I know. Do it anyway. 12 fighters against 3, maybe 4, raiders, spread across 5 moving targets, was not a comfortable number, but a station full of unused fighters had never once saved anyone, and I was not about to start collecting excuses for the first time in my career. The Skarn Raiders hit the formation a few seconds later, and for a while, there was no time to think in full sentences, only fragments. Toby Lang's voice, reporting a raider breaking off toward the 3rd hauler. Daniel calling a course correction. Nora feeding me shield percentages faster than I could read them. I watched the 3rd raider close on its target and made the call myself. "Toby, you're closest. Peel off and take the intercept." "Copy, Commander." His voice was tight but steady. Toby had been flying for us for 2 years, young enough that I still sometimes forgot how good he had gotten. He caught the raider a bare few seconds before it would have reached the hauler's hull, and the 2 ships spun off together, trading fire in a dance too fast for the display to render smoothly. His shield percentage fell in a straight, steep line, and there was nothing I could do about it from where I sat, except keep flying the rest of the battle and trust him to fly his piece of it. That was when Nora's 4th contact stopped being a guess. "Confirmed, 4th Raider, coming in low behind the 2nd hauler," she said. "It was hiding under the others the whole time. It's going to reach the hauler before anyone can reposition." I did the math fast and without comfort. Every fighter close enough to help was already committed somewhere else. "Daniel, break off 2 from the lead hauler's escort. That ship has the thickest hull in the convoy. It can absorb a graze if it has to. The 2nd hauler can't." "Copy. Redirecting now." The two fighters made it with barely a margin to spare, catching the fourth raider before it reached firing range, and for a few seconds the entire battle felt balanced on a wire thin enough to snap in either direction. It did not snap. The fourth raider peeled away, damaged, and the lead hauler took exactly the graze I had gambled it could absorb. Toby held his own raider off long enough for two more fighters to arrive and finish it. His fighter limped back toward the station afterward, venting atmosphere from a hull breach, but he came back. That was the difference, most days, between a bad report and a funeral. This time it was a bad report. The relay room was not so fortunate. Somewhere in the middle of the fight, one of the raiders broke through the fighter screen entirely and put a burst into the outer hull, close to the shield relay that kept the convoy's jump gate corridor stable. Without that relay, the gate would destabilize, and every ship in the corridor, ours and theirs, would be stranded in open space, with the raiders still circling. Ellis Rowe was on duty in that relay room. I did not order what happened next. I only learned of it afterward, from the automated logs, because there was no time for him to ask permission and no time for me to give it. He stayed at his post and rerouted power through a secondary line by hand, faster than the automated systems could manage alone, and he kept that relay stable for the 90 extra seconds the convoy needed to reach the gate safely. The hull breach reached his section 11 seconds after the last hauler made the jump. I have read that timeline more times than I can count since. 11 seconds. It has never once gotten easier to read. The raiders broke off once the convoy was through, the way they always did once there was nothing left worth the risk to them. 4 Scarn ships turned and vanished back into the dark they had come from, and Station 7's fighters formed up and returned to the deck, and somewhere behind me, Nora Bishop was already compiling the after-action report, because that was her job, and grief, on a station like ours, had to wait its turn behind the paperwork. We had saved the convoy. All 6 haulers, all their cargo, every crew member aboard them. Wren's cruiser was untouched. My station had 1 fighter in for heavy repair, 1 relay room that would need to be rebuilt from the frame outward, and 1 name that would be read at a service in 3 days, once there was finally time to hold one. I found Toby in the medical bay before I did anything else, still in his flight suit, 1 arm braced, while a medic checked a cracked rib the crash webbing had given him on the way in. "You look worse than the sensor readout made it sound," I told him. "Feels worse too, Commander." He managed something close to a grin. "Worth it, though. That transport had 11 crew on it. Would have been more than a bad afternoon if that raider had gotten through. You bought them the whole margin." I saw the feed. I meant it plainly, the way I tried to mean every word I gave my people, because praise that isn't specific rarely lands the way it should. Rest. That's an order, not a suggestion. "Copy, Commander." He said it the same way he said it in the middle of a fight, steady, like the words themselves were part of the job. I checked on the rest of the wing before I let myself sit down anywhere, because a commander who only shows up for the dramatic moments isn't much of one, in my experience. Small things mattered more than people expected. A hand on a shoulder, a name remembered, a thank you that didn't wait for a report to justify itself. I wrote my own section of that report late that night, alone, after everyone else had gone to rest they badly needed. I wrote it plainly, crediting every name that had earned a place in it, because if nobody else was going to remember what Ellis Rowe did with his last 90 seconds, I intended to make certain the record at least tried. I had stopped expecting thanks a long time before that day, so I did not go looking for any. What caught me off guard, 22 hours later, was opening the Concord Fleet Bulletin to find a single paragraph describing the engagement, crediting the safe arrival of the convoy to what it called the decisive maneuvering of the escorting Veth cruiser. There was no mention of Station 7, no mention of the 12 fighters, no mention of Toby Lang's hull breach or the 90 seconds he bought with it, or Ellis Rowe, who had bought 90 more with everything he had. Nora found me reading it a second time. "It's not an accident, Commander. Someone drafted that language on purpose." "I know," I said, and I did, because I had read enough Concord bulletins by then to recognize policy dressed up as an oversight. Vaughn found me not long after that, before I had even finished drafting my objection. Vaughn was Veth, like Wren, but where Wren followed the manual to the letter, Vaughn had spent 3 years as our liaison, learning exactly how much the manual left out. Vaughn never knocked when the news was bad. "You need to see this before you send that objection," Vaughn said, holding out a data slate. "The Assembly has already scheduled you to appear, not to receive thanks, Commander, to answer for the deployment." I read the summons twice, hoping the second reading might soften the words. It didn't. The Concord Assembly wanted to know why a station commander had authorized fighters into contested space beyond the scope of her standing orders, and why one Concord asset, meaning Ellis Rowe's relay station, had been lost in the process. They were not calling me in to talk about the convoy we saved. They were calling me in to talk about the risk I had taken to save it, as though the two things could be pulled apart from each other, as though there had ever been a version of that day where both were true at once, the convoy safe and nobody paying for it. I looked up at Vaughn. "When?" "4 days, Vaughn said. "I am sorry, Commander. I wanted you to have time to prepare." I did not feel prepared. For the first time in 6 years on this station, the ground under my feet seemed to have quietly changed shape while I was busy keeping other people alive on top of it. 4 days did not feel like very much time at all to prepare for a room that had already decided what it wanted to hear. "Explain to this assembly," High Delegate Koss said, before I had even finished crossing the floor to my designated position, "why you gambled the lives of 4 Concord personnel to protect cargo that was already fully insured." I had expected hostility. I had not expected it before I had even taken my seat. 4 Concord personnel survived that engagement, Delegate, I said. One of my own people did not. "A regrettable loss," Koss said, in a tone that made the word regrettable sound like a formality he was eager to move past. "One this assembly might have avoided entirely had station protocol been followed instead of improvised. The chamber was a wide half-circle of raised seating, delegates from a dozen member species arranged by block rather than alphabetically, so that a glance across the room told you exactly which interests sat beside which. The Ushar delegation filled nearly a third of the upper tier. Koss himself sat at the center of that block, exactly where a delegate sits when he intends to be watched, dressed in the deep formal colors the Ushar reserved for sessions they expected to win. Humanities delegation, small and recently seated by Concord standards, occupied a narrow section near the back, close enough to hear everything and far enough to be reminded, every session, exactly how much weight our seats carried in the final vote. That section had grown only twice in 2 decades. Both times after a vote, nobody sitting in it had been permitted to cast. Vaughn sat in that section too, technically as a Veth liaison observer rather than a voting delegate, which meant Vaughn could watch everything and formally say nothing, a fact I suspected Koss had planned for well in advance. "Commander Voss," the speaker said, a tall, measured Concord official whose species I had never quite placed, "please respond to Delegate Koss's question." I stood. "I followed the tactical situation as I found it, Speaker." The escorting cruiser withdrew to protect its lead vessel, which is permitted under the fleet manual Delegate Koss is so fond of quoting. That decision left 5 cargo haulers without cover. I sent fighters to cover them because the manual does not require me to let ships die simply because someone else's orders left them exposed. A murmur ran through the lower tier, quickly enough that I could not tell if it favored me or not. Koss did not raise his voice. He never needed to. And the relay technician who died holding a gate open past its rated tolerance. Was that also outside the manual's requirements, Commander, or was that simply outside your control? Something cold settled behind my ribs. Ellis Rowe held that gate open because the alternative was stranding every ship in that corridor, including the Veth cruiser Delegate Koss seemed so concerned about protecting. He made that choice himself, in 11 seconds, because there was no time to ask permission from this chamber first. a convenient excuse for a chain of command that appears, again, to have skipped several links, Koss said. With respect, delegate, my chain of command was fully aware. I gave the order. If there is blame to assign it to me, not to a man who is no longer here to answer for himself. And if this assembly wants to talk about accountability, let's talk about it honestly. 6 years, my station has held that stretch of the Fenwall line. 6 years of engagements that never once made it into a bulletin with a human name attached to the outcome. I did not come here to ask for credit. I came because I was ordered to explain a choice that saved 6 ships and every person aboard them, and I intend to explain it exactly that plainly, however many times this chamber would prefer to hear it phrased differently. Koss's mouth thinned. Passion is not evidence, Commander. No, I said, but 6 years of surviving out there, while every bulletin credits someone else, is starting to feel like evidence of something. Delegate, I will let this chamber decide what. That, at least, drew a longer silence, the kind that told me the room had heard it and would remember it, whichever way the vote eventually went. The speaker moved things along before that silence could turn into something Koss could use. Delegate Koss, do you have a formal motion before this assembly, or simply questions for the commander? I have a motion, Koss said, and it became clear, in that moment, that the questions had never been about answers at all. They had been the warm-up act. This assembly has, on multiple occasions this cycle, seen human station commanders exercise unilateral tactical authority, resulting in the loss of Concord assets, Koss said, turning now to address the full chamber rather than me. I do not raise this to diminish human service, which this assembly has always valued. The words came out smooth and rehearsed, the kind of sentence built to be quoted later without its context. I raise it because value without oversight becomes risk, and risk without shared accountability becomes a liability every member species pays for, whether or not they hold a seat on the Fenwall line. He let that sit for a moment before continuing. I move that all human-commanded stations on the Fenwall line adopt a rotating co-command structure, with a Concord-appointed senior officer holding equal authority alongside the standing human commander, effective within 30 days. Equal authority. I knew exactly what that phrase meant in practice, even dressed as carefully as Koss had dressed it. It meant every order I gave would need a second signature from someone whose species had never once flown a patrol route on that line. Someone appointed specifically to slow me down in the name of oversight, in the exact moments when slowing down cost lives. I did not wait to be recognized. Speaker, with respect, this motion does not address accountability. It addresses control. A second signature does not make a station safer. It makes every decision slower, and out on that line, slow decisions get people killed just as surely as reckless ones do. The commander will have her opportunity to address the motion during formal debate, the speaker said, but debate follows procedure, and procedure calls for the motion to be read into the record first. I sat back down, aware that formal debate, whenever it arrived, would already be shaped by delegates who had made up their minds the moment Koss said the word oversight. Vaughn tried to speak. I heard the attempt begin, a single syllable before the speaker's voice cut cleanly over it. Liaison Vaughn, your presence here is as an observer for the VETH delegation. You do not hold floor privileges on a matter concerning human personnel structure. With respect, Speaker, Vaughn said anyway, the escort commander's report from the very engagement under discussion has not been entered into this record in full, and I believe it contradicts. Noted, and out of order, the speaker said. Delegate Koss's motion is on the floor. We will proceed to a vote. Vaughn sat back down, jaw tight, and I recognized that this too had been planned for. Wren's full report, whatever it actually said, was never going to make it into this room in a form that could change anything, because the people who controlled the agenda had no interest in a version of events where a human commander's judgment had been correct. Before the vote opened formally, a delegate from one of the quieter member worlds near the bottom tier of the chamber, a species that rarely spoke at all in session, leaned toward me during the brief procedural pause. For what it is worth, Commander, several of us do not agree with this motion. Then vote against it, I said, not unkindly, because I already suspected the answer. Our trade routes run through 3 systems the AwayHFY block controls entirely. A vote against delegate costs today becomes a shipping delay next quarter, and a shipping delay next quarter becomes a famine on our home colonies the quarter after that. I am sorry, Commander. Sympathy has never once fed anyone. He withdrew before I could answer, back into the anonymous rows of delegates who would vote exactly the way their fear told them to. I did not blame him for it, not entirely. Fear is not the same thing as malice, even when it produces the same vote. But understanding a delegate's fear and forgiving the vote it bought were 2 very different things, and I was not yet certain I was ready to do the second one. The vote itself took less time than the argument that preceded it. Concord Assembly votes were weighted by trade contribution rather than simple headcount, a rule written generations before humanity had ever joined, back when the founding species had wanted a system that protected established interests from newer, smaller ones. No species traded more, across more of Concord space, than the AwayHFY. Koss did not need to convince a majority of delegates. He needed to convince, or frighten, enough of the ones whose trade routes his bloc could quietly threaten to disrupt. I watched the tally build on the display above the speaker's podium, delegation by delegation, and recognized I was watching something that had very little to do with the actual events on that convoy run. This was a vote about leverage, about which member species could afford to say no to the AwayHFY bloc and which could not, and humanity, for all 6 years of service on that line, still did not carry enough independent trade weight to matter in that particular arithmetic. We were valuable. We were not, in the terms this chamber actually used to measure value, powerful. The motion passed by a margin narrow enough to prove some delegates had hesitated, and wide enough to mean the hesitation had not mattered. The speaker read the result into the record in the same even tone used for every other piece of assembly business that day, as though a decision that would reshape command authority across an entire defensive line was no different from approving a shipping tariff. The motion carries. Implementation notice will be sent to all affected stations within 5 days. I did not say anything further. There was nothing left on the floor worth saying that would not simply become another quote in another delegate's mouth, reshaped into something it never meant. A member of the Terran diplomatic staff, a quiet aide named Grace, who had sat through every session that cycle without once being asked to speak, met me at the edge of the human section as I gathered my things. I'll have this filed with the Council within the hour, Commander. Word for word. Thank you, I said, though some part of me already knew that a transcript, however accurate, was not going to be the thing that changed anyone's mind on Earth. What would change minds was the plain, unavoidable fact of the vote itself, sitting there, in black and white, with no language soft enough to disguise what it actually did. Vaughn caught up with me in the corridor outside, once the chamber had emptied enough for a private word to actually be private. I am sorry, Commander. I should have found a way to enter Wren's report regardless of the ruling. You'd have been removed from the chamber, and it still wouldn't have changed the vote, I said. Koss had the numbers before he opened his mouth. That does not make it right. No, I agreed. It doesn't. Vaughn walked with me toward the transport bay in silence for a while. The kind of silence that meant there was more to say, and neither of us had found the shape of it yet. Finally, Vaughn spoke again. The implementation notice will name your replacement co-commander within the week. I do not yet know who the Assembly intends to appoint. It won't matter who they send, I said. The problem was never a specific name. It's the second signature itself. I understand that better than you may think, Commander. I have spent 3 years watching how much slower everything becomes once 2 chains of command must agree before either one may act. Vaughn paused at the edge of the transport bay. Word of this vote will reach your Terran Council within hours. I do not know how they will respond. I did not know either, not really. though some part of me already suspected the answer would not look like anything the Concorde Assembly had planned for. I had spent 6 years assuming the Concorde's patience with us, and our patience with the Concorde, were the same kind of patience, built to last about as long as either side needed it to. I was starting to suspect, standing in that corridor, with a demotion, dressed up as oversight, now waiting in my inbox, that I had been wrong about that. Before boarding the transport back to Station 7, I sent Daniel a short message of my own, because I did not want him hearing the result from a bulletin the way I had once learned about the convoy report. Vote passed. Co-command structure incoming. Tell the crew I will brief them properly once I am back. His reply came through before the transport had even finished its boarding sequence. Copy that. We will be ready, whatever it looks like. It was such a small thing, 4 words from a man I trusted more than almost anyone, and it steadied me more than anything else that entire day had managed to. I was right to wonder. On Earth, in a chamber far less patient with careful language than the one I had just left, Director Owen Hale was already reading the same vote result I was, and reaching a very different conclusion about what it meant. I would not learn the shape of that conclusion for several more hours, but I would remember, later, that it took Earth less time to decide what the vote meant than it had taken this assembly to hold the vote itself. The Scarn ship came in alone, which was rare enough on its own to put every sensor operator on the station on edge before anyone had said a word. One contact, unarmed configuration, holding at the edge of scanner range, Nora reported. It's not attacking, it's just sitting there. Since when do they sit still? Daniel asked from the deck below. That was the question, exactly. Scarn ships did not idle. They came in fast, took what they could, and left the instant the cost outweighed the gain. A single ship holding position at the edge of our range for 11 straight minutes was not an attack. It was a test, and I did not like what it meant that they were suddenly interested in testing us at all. Hold fighters at ready alert, I said. Nobody launches unless it moves. Understood, Daniel said, though I could hear, even over the comm, that he liked the order about as much as I did. Waiting has never once been the part of this job anyone signs up for, and it is very often the part that matters most. It held there for 6 more minutes, long enough for me to start wondering whether it was gathering data on our response times, our patrol spacing, the gaps we left when we rotated shifts, all the small details that would matter enormously to something planning a larger attack later. Then it turned and slipped back into the dark the way it had come, without ever firing a shot, and Station 7 breathed out all at once, the way a room does when a held breath finally lets go. Log it, I told Nora. Every second of it. If they're studying us, I want to know exactly what they saw. I did not get the chance to think much further about what that visit meant, because 40 minutes later, a priority channel opened that I had never once seen active in 6 years on this post, reserved for a single kind of message and no other. Direct transmission from the Terran Council. Director Owen Hale. I took it alone, in my quarters, because some messages are not meant to be received in front of a crew, not until you know what you are about to ask of them. Owen Hale's message was recorded, not live, which told me something on its own about how carefully Earth wanted this handled. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Commander Voss, by now you will have heard the result of the assembly vote regarding co-command authority on the Fenwal line. The Terran Council convened within hours of receiving that result. This message is to inform you, ahead of the formal notice reaching Concorde channels, that the Terran Council has voted to invoke Clause 9 of the founding Concorde Treaty, effective immediately upon this transmission. I knew what Clause 9 was. Every station commander did, the way you know the fire evacuation route in a building you never expect to burn. It was the withdrawal clause, written into the treaty at humanity's own insistence during the founding negotiations, back when a young and uncertain Earth had wanted an emergency exit built into an alliance it did not yet trust. Nobody who wrote it, I suspected, had ever truly believed it would be used. This is not a declaration of hostility toward the Concorde, Hale continued. It is the opposite. It is a recognition that a defense built on service, the Concord will not fairly credit, and command authority, the Concord will not respect, is not a partnership. It is an arrangement, and arrangements can end. Effective in 72 hours, all Terran forces on the Fenwall line are to complete an orderly withdrawal to Terran space. Commander Voss, you are to oversee the withdrawal of Station 7 personally. Full logistical guidance follows this message. I am sorry to hand you this on top of everything else this week has already asked of you. The recording ended, and I sat in my quarters for a long moment, feeling something unfamiliar settle over me. Not relief, not quite grief either, some third thing sitting uneasily between them. 72 hours to unwind 6 years. I called Daniel and Nora in first, because they needed to hear it from me directly, and they needed to hear it before the rest of the crew did. I did not soften it, because there was no version of the news that came out softer with delay. We're leaving, I said, all of it, full withdrawal, 72 hours, Terran Council order. Daniel was quiet for a moment. All of it. The shield relays too? Everything that's ours to take, we take. Everything that's Concord property, we hand back according to the transfer protocol. The shield network we've been maintaining reverts to Concord Engineering as of the deadline. After that, it's not our responsibility to keep it running. It's not going to keep running, Nora said. Not without us. You know that. I know it, I said. I don't think the council doesn't know it either. I think that might be the point. Nobody in that room said anything for a while after that, because there was nothing comfortable to say about a decision built, at least in part, on the uncomfortable truth that the Concord had never truly understood what it would lose until it lost it. Telling the rest of the crew took the better part of an hour, delivered in small groups rather than one announcement, because I wanted every person on that station to have room to ask their own questions rather than absorb the news as a crowd. Most of them took it the way soldiers take orders they don't love, but recognize as orders regardless. A few of them, the younger ones especially, looked something closer to relieved, and I understood that too. Toby Lang, still healing from the hull breach that had nearly cost him his ship days earlier, asked only one question. Are we finally getting our own line to defend instead of theirs? That's the idea, I told him, and watched something in his shoulders unclench that I hadn't fully realized was still tight. Not everyone took it that easily. One of our senior technicians, a woman who had transferred to Station 7 the same year I took command, asked me directly whether this meant 6 years of work were being thrown away over politics neither of us had any real say in. I did not have a comfortable answer for her, because the honest one, that yes, in part, it was exactly that, would not have made either of us feel any better about the days ahead. What I told her instead was true in a different way. Nothing we did out here gets thrown away just because the address changes. The line moves. The work doesn't. The logistics themselves began within the hour, and they were nothing like the tidy word withdrawal suggests when you first hear it. Every piece of equipment on that station had to be sorted into one of two categories: Terran property to load onto transports, or Concord property to be logged, tagged, and left exactly where regulation required it to sit. Nora ran the manifest personally, checking every line against the transfer protocol twice, because she had decided, without needing to be told, that nobody was going to be able to accuse this station of taking so much as a spare bolt that belonged to someone else. We moved the fighters first, since they were ours outright and easiest to account for. Then personal effects. Then classified systems that could not be allowed to fall into Concord hands regardless of ownership, stripped down to bare housings and packed for transport under guard. What remained, piece by piece, was the shield relay network, the sensor arrays, the long-range communication towers that had let this station serve as an early warning post for half the sector, all of it Concord funded, all of it now formally reverting to people who had never once had to maintain it themselves. I found one of our newer technicians, barely out of training, sitting on a crate in the corridor outside the barracks, staring at a small potted plant she had somehow kept alive on this station for the better part of a year, despite regulations that technically discouraged organic clutter on a defense post. "Can't decide if it counts as Terran property or if I'm supposed to leave it," she said, half joking, though her eyes suggested she wasn't joking at all. "It's yours," I told her. "Grew it, kept it alive. It travels with you. Some things don't belong on a transfer manifest." She nodded, wrapped the pot carefully in a spare shirt, and carried it onto the transport herself an hour later. It was such a small thing to remember out of 6 years, and yet I have remembered it more clearly than almost anything else from that day. Telling Vaughn was harder than telling any of them, and I put it off longer than I should have, until there was barely a full day left before the deadline. Vaughn came to my office before I could send for them, which did not surprise me. Vaughn had always had a talent for arriving exactly when arriving mattered most. "I already know," Vaughn said, before I could find a way to start. "The transfer protocols came through Veth channels an hour ago. Full Terran withdrawal from the Fenwal line. I'm sorry you're hearing it from a document instead of from me." "You have had 72 hours to end 6 years, Commander. I do not fault you for the order of operations." Vaughn sat, folding both hands together in the careful, deliberate way that I had learned, over 3 years, meant Vaughn was choosing every word with more care than usual. "May I ask you something honestly? Always. Do you believe this is the right decision?" I thought about that longer than the question probably deserved, because it was the first time in 72 hours anyone had asked me what I believed rather than what my orders were. "I believe it's the only decision that was going to make anyone in that assembly chamber understand what they've actually been asking us to carry. I don't know yet if it's right. I know it's honest, in a way that chamber hasn't been in a long time." "The Veth delegation did not support Kasa's motion," Vaughn said. "I want you to know that, whatever comes after this, not all of us. I know that. I've always known that." I met Vaughn's eyes, because this part, at least, deserved to be said plainly. "This isn't about you. It was never about you." "I understand that." Vaughn paused. "It will not make the next several months easier for the people I answer to when the Raiders learn this line is thinner than it was." We both knew, without saying it aloud again, exactly what that would mean for a species that had leaned on human defense for longer than either of us had served together. Midway through the second day, a short personal message arrived from Owen Hale, separate from the official channel, brief enough that I suspected he had written it himself, rather than an aide drafting it for him. He asked only how the withdrawal was progressing, and whether the crew was holding together under the timeline. I answered honestly that we would make the deadline, and that making it clean mattered to every person on this station as much as making it on time. He replied with 4 words. "Then that is enough." It was, oddly, the first message from Earth in this entire account that had felt like it came from a person rather than a policy. It was during the final 6 hours, with most of the station already stripped down to bare, transferable infrastructure, that the alert came through that tested every ounce of discipline I had built over 6 years of command. A Concord mining outpost 2 systems over, well outside our jurisdiction but still inside old patrol range, sent a distress signal reporting a Skarn raid already underway, defenses failing, and no Concord fleet close enough to respond in time. Daniel found me the moment the signal came through. "Commander, we could still make that intercept. We're not fully stood down yet." Nora looked up from her console too, and I watched the same argument settle behind her eyes before she'd said a word of it aloud. 4 fighters are still fueled and flight ready. We could be there inside the hour. "What's the nearest Concord fleet response time?" I asked, because even a decision made on principle deserved to be made with the facts in front of it, rather than instinct alone. Nora checked. "Closest cruiser is 2 hours out. Nothing closer is currently deployed in that sector. 2 hours against an outpost already under fire. I knew exactly what that gap meant for the people on the ground down there, and I let myself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as I could afford to, before I answered. I felt the pull of it as strongly as either of them did, the old reflex that had never once, in 6 years, let a distress call go unanswered while we had ships that could fly. But standing in the half-empty command deck, with our own withdrawal order still open on the display in front of me, I also knew exactly what would happen if we answered that call. "If we launch," I said, "Ka stands up in that assembly next week and tells every delegate in the chamber that the withdrawal was theater, that humans can't actually stay away, that we'll always come running no matter how badly we're treated, because we care more about looking useful than being respected." And he'll be right, Daniel. That's the part that would hurt the most. He'd be right. Daniel didn't answer right away. I watched the argument play out across his face, the same argument playing out in my own chest, and I let him have the moment before I said the rest of it. "We're not the only defense that outpost has a right to expect," I said. "The Concord fleet has ships, slower ones, more cautious ones, but ships. If they can't reach that outpost in time, that's the cost of a system that spent this week deciding our command wasn't worth respecting. That cost isn't ours to carry anymore. Not today." It was, without question, the hardest order I gave in 6 years of command, harder than any order I had given in the middle of actual combat, because standing down and doing nothing has never once come naturally to anyone who chose this life in the first place. The outpost held, in the end, barely, with heavy losses and a Concord response that arrived 40 minutes later than anyone there needed it to. I did not learn that until after we had already crossed back into Terran space, and when I did, I sat with it for a long time before I let myself feel anything about it at all. The last hour on Station 7, I walked the corridors alone, the way I imagine every commander does when a posting ends, checking rooms that no longer needed checking, out of habit more than necessity. I stopped longest in the relay room that had been rebuilt from the frame outward after the convoy engagement, the one Ellis Rowe had died keeping stable. It had been transferred, like everything else, back to Concord Engineering. Someone else would maintain it now, or more likely, given everything I had learned about how the Concord valued maintenance nobody could see, no one would. On the workbench in that relay room, someone, probably Ellis himself, had left a half-finished repair log open on a datapad, notes written in the shorthand every good technician develops after enough years on the job. I read the last line he had entered before that shift began: "Relay holding steady. Recommend routine maintenance only." He had no way of knowing, writing that, how untrue it would turn out to be within the hour. I powered the pad down, set it exactly where I had found it, and left the room the way regulation required, which is to say, empty, and exactly as it was. Vaughn met me at the final airlock, the last member of the Concord staff still aboard. "I don't have a word for this that isn't goodbye," Vaughn said. "I dislike goodbye. It has always sounded too final for what I actually feel." "Then don't say it," I said. "Say something else." Vaughn considered that for a moment. "Until the line holds again, Commander, whichever side ends up holding it." I left Station 7 for the last time, 9 minutes before the deadline, on the final Terran transport out, and I watched through the rear viewport as the station's lights began going dark behind us, section by section, much like a house goes dark, room by room, once the last person inside it finally leaves. Somewhere in the dark that used to be my command deck, a light I had checked every night for 6 years blinked off for what I understood, even then, would not be forever, but would certainly not be soon. The message came through at 3 in the morning, Earth time, on a personal channel I had not expected anyone to still be using. I was 6 weeks into a training assignment, outside a city I still hadn't fully learned my way around, teaching new pilots maneuvers I used to run in my sleep, when my comm lit up with an old contact code I recognized instantly: Ren. I almost didn't answer. 6 weeks of distance had not been enough to make that decision easy, but old habits, the kind built from years of never letting a call go unanswered, are harder to unlearn than 6 weeks can manage. "Commander Voss." Ren's voice sounded thinner than I remembered it, stretched over something that wasn't quite fear, but was standing close enough to it. I apologize for the hour. I did not know who else still had a working channel out here. What's happening, Ren? The outpost, 2 systems from your old station, the one that called for help during your withdrawal. A pause, heavy enough that I knew before he said the rest. It fell 3 days ago. Concord Fleet response arrived, but not in time, and not in strength enough to hold the line afterward. The Scarn have not stopped moving since. The floor of that small training base room seemed to tilt slightly under me, the particular vertigo of hearing news you had feared and half expected, arriving anyway with the full weight of becoming real. How far have they pushed? 3 systems, perhaps 4, by the time this message reaches you. Concord Command is reorganizing defense lines further back, but Commander Voss, I flew that line beside your people for 3 years. Concord Fleet doctrine was never built to hold ground the way your station held it. It was built to protect assets, not people, and assets can always be replaced from further back. I knew exactly what he meant, because I had watched that doctrine in action myself, the day Ren's own cruiser pulled back to protect its lead hauler and left 5 ships exposed. It was not that Concord forces lacked courage, it was that their entire structure had never been built around the particular, unreasonable stubbornness that had made Station 7 hold ground a sane fleet manual would have told it to abandon. Is Vaughn safe? I asked, because that question had been sitting under my ribs since the moment I recognized Ren's contact code, and I could not get through the rest of this conversation without asking it first. Vaughn's outpost has not fallen. Not yet. I cannot promise you it will hold. Ren hesitated again. I am not contacting you through official channels, Commander. I want to be clear about that. I do not know what I am asking for by calling you. I only know that I watched your people do something out here that we have not been able to do since you left, and some part of me hoped hearing that from someone who lived it might matter more than hearing it from a report. I did not sleep again that night. I lay awake in a small assigned room that had never felt like mine the way Station 7's cramped quarters once had, running numbers I no longer had any authority to act on, until the sky outside finally turned pale and it was time to stand in front of a class of pilots who had never flown anything more dangerous than a training simulator. Teaching that class felt strange in a way it hadn't the day before. I stood in front of 20 young faces who had joined the service, hoping to be sent exactly where I had just been recalled from, and I found myself, for the first time, unsure whether to feel proud of that hope or afraid for it. One cadet in particular, a serious young man who reminded me uncomfortably of Toby at that same age, asked after class whether the stories about the old Fenwall line were true, the ones about a station that held a corridor open under fire long enough to save an entire convoy. I told him yes, all of it, and did not tell him the name of the technician who made it possible, because that name belonged in a service record and a memorial, not in a hallway conversation with a cadet who had not yet earned the weight of carrying it. He would learn it eventually. Everyone who mattered eventually did. I told Daniel and Nora about Ren's call that same evening, over a meal none of us finished. Daniel took it the way he took most hard news, quietly, turning his cup in slow circles while he worked through what it meant. Nora asked the only question that mattered to her. Is there anything we're allowed to do? No, I said. Not officially. Not yet. And unofficially? Unofficially, we do our jobs here, and we wait, and we trust that Earth knows what it's asking of the people still standing where we used to stand. I did not enjoy saying it. I said it anyway, because it was true, and because Nora deserved the truth even when it wasn't the answer either of us wanted. In the days that followed, I watched the wider picture fill in through channels that had nothing to do with official Terran Council briefings, because the Terran Council, I quickly learned, was choosing its public statements with the same careful discipline I had used standing down at that airlock. The economic reports told part of the story first, the way they usually do, arriving faster than the human cost, because someone, somewhere, is always tracking the money before they finish counting the losses. 3 major trade corridors that ran through the old Fenwall line had gone dark within 2 weeks of full withdrawal, either destroyed outright or abandoned as too dangerous to run. Shipping insurance rates across that entire sector tripled inside a month. The AwayHFY trade block, the same block that had backed every word out of Koss's mouth in that assembly chamber, held more contracts along those corridors than any other Concord member. One Concord commentary program, syndicated widely enough that even Earth's monitoring services picked it up, ran a segment asking bluntly why an alliance of a dozen advanced species had allowed its entire eastern defense to rest on the willingness of a single junior member. Nobody on that program had an answer that did not eventually circle back to cost, and cost, I had learned firsthand, was a word the Concord only seemed to understand once the bill actually arrived. I want to say I felt satisfaction reading that. Mostly, I felt tired, the specific tiredness of watching a truth you already knew get proven at a cost you never wanted anyone to pay to prove it. The political reports came next, filtering through channels Vaughn had once used to keep me informed, now relayed secondhand through contacts who still trusted me enough to keep talking. Koss's own block was fracturing under him, smaller AwayHFY trade families breaking ranks publicly, several of them stating outright that the vote to strip human command authority had cost them more in 6 weeks than 6 years of what Koss had once called an unfair defense subsidy. A high delegate who survives a vote by a narrow margin does not survive a second vote quite so easily once the margin's own beneficiaries start asking what exactly they bought with it. AwayHFY, for his part, gave exactly one public statement during those weeks, brief enough to fit in a single news cycle. He confirmed the Terran Council had invoked Clause 9, confirmed the withdrawal was complete and lawful under treaty terms, and declined every question afterward about whether Earth had any intention of returning to the Fenwal line under current conditions. I watched that clip more times than I probably should have, looking for something in his expression the cameras hadn't caught, and never quite finding it. AwayHFY had always been better than most at keeping his intentions off his face. 3 weeks into the collapse, another message reached me, this one not through Wren, but through Vaughn directly, the first contact since the withdrawal, cut short partway through. "Commander, I hope this reaches you." Vaughn's voice, steady even now, carried a strain I had never heard in 3 years of working together. "The outpost has taken damage. We are holding, for now, with reinforced Concord fleet elements that arrived later than any of us needed them to. I wanted you to know I am." The message ended there, cut off mid-sentence, and stayed that way for 11 hours before a second, shorter transmission finally came through, confirming Vaughn was alive, injured, and off the front line for now, recovering at a Concord medical station 2 jumps back from what remained of the border. I sat with that gap, those 11 hours, longer than I have sat with almost anything else in this entire account, because it was the first time since leaving Station 7 that the distance between Earth and the Fenwal line had felt less like a policy decision and more like an ocean I could not cross fast enough if I needed to. I spent those 11 hours the way I imagine most people spend hours like that, doing small, useless things to keep from doing nothing at all. I reorganized a supply locker that did not need reorganizing. I ran an extra flight simulation with a cadet who had not asked for one. I checked the same unresponsive channel on my comm every few minutes, long after I knew, rationally, that checking it more often would not make an answer arrive any faster. Daniel found me there, near the end of it, sitting in the base's small operations room well past midnight, and did not say anything at all. He simply sat down across from me and waited it out with me, which was, I have come to think since, exactly the right thing to do, and exactly the thing neither of us could have said out loud without breaking whatever composure either of us still had left. I was not the only one feeling that particular kind of helplessness. Across the training base, and I suspected across every posting where former Fenwal personnel had been reassigned, the same restless question moved through every conversation that wasn't strictly official. Nobody asked it directly, because AwayHFY's public discipline had made it clear that asking directly, in the wrong forum, would not be welcomed. But I heard it anyway, in how carefully people avoided the subject, in how fast the room went silent whenever a Concorde news segment came on. Are we really not going back? I heard variations of it everywhere, in the mess hall, in the corridors between training blocks, in messages from former Fenwall crew scattered across a dozen new postings who still wrote to each other more out of habit than anything official. Some of them had already requested transfers back to any active posting that would take them, unwilling to sit still while a border they used to call home came apart 3 systems at a time. I understood the impulse completely. I did not act on it myself, because someone at every level of this had to hold the line the council had actually drawn, even when holding it felt like the harder version of doing nothing. Even Toby, reassigned to the same base as an instructor for newer pilots, asked me privately whether he thought the council would hold its position if the losses kept climbing. I told him the truth, which was that I did not know, and that not knowing was, in its own way, the entire point of a decision this serious. If Earth's resolve had a visible bottom, the Concorde would have already found it and pushed straight through. The Terran Council held that line without cracking for 5 full weeks, which I understood, by then, was itself the entire point of the exercise. Clause 9 had never been invoked to punish the Concorde. It had been invoked to prove something the Concorde had spent years refusing to believe, which was that humanity's presence on that border had never been an inevitability owed to anyone. It had been a choice, made and remade every single day by people like Ellis Rowe and Toby Lang and every other name I had watched cross that station's roster over 6 years, and choices, once revealed as choices, can always be unmade. The proof, once it arrived in full, arrived faster and harder than even I had expected. In the 6th week, the Concorde Assembly convened an emergency session, the kind that got called when enough delegates from enough blocks finally agreed on something, which by every account I later heard had not happened easily. Kaas's own allies forced the agenda, not out of any loyalty to the argument I had made in that chamber weeks earlier, but because their trade losses had grown too large to explain away with the language that had once made stripping human authority sound like careful oversight. The Assembly voted, this time, to authorize a formal delegation, empowered to travel to Earth directly and negotiate terms for a Terran return to Fenwall defense duties. I learned the name of the delegation's lead envoy the same day everyone else did, from the same brief Concorde statement that named every member of the traveling party. High Delegate Kaas would be leading the delegation personally. I read that line twice, half expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something easier to believe. They didn't. 6 weeks earlier, Kaas had stood in a chamber and asked me to explain myself for the crime of saving a convoy. Now Kaas was coming to Earth to ask for something considerably harder to phrase as a formality. I did not know, reading that statement, whether I would be anywhere near the room when he arrived. I assumed I would not be. I had been reassigned, quietly and without ceremony, to a training post 2 hours outside the capital, and nothing in 6 weeks had suggested the Terran Council saw any further use for a commander whose station no longer existed in any form the Concorde would recognize. I went back to my quarters that night, packed nothing, expected nothing, and told myself, without entirely believing it, that whatever happened next in that negotiation room was no longer any business of mine. I was wrong about that, though it would take one more message from Director Hale himself before I understood exactly how wrong. The Concorde envoy ship entered Earth orbit at first light, and by the time it had cleared final approach clearance, half the news channels on the planet were already arguing about whether it should have been allowed to land at all. Protesters had gathered outside 3 separate council buildings before the ship had even touched down, some angry that Earth was entertaining the Concorde at all after everything the withdrawal had cost this planet in reputation and resources. Others, angry that the council had waited this long to force the Concorde's hand. Security around the capital had tripled overnight. I noticed it the moment my transport landed. Checkpoints doubled at every intersection, more uniforms on the street than I had seen in the capital in years. I watched the descent from the observation deck of the same Terran Council building where, 6 weeks earlier, Owen Hale had recorded the message that ended my command of Station 7. I had no reason to expect I would be standing there that morning. I had been reassigned to a training post 2 hours outside the capital and had planned to spend that day running formation drills with pilots who had never once seen actual combat. Instead, a council transport had collected me before dawn, with instructions vague enough that I had spent the entire flight in without knowing exactly why I had been summoned. Owen Hale met me himself in the corridor outside the main negotiation chamber, which told me something on its own, because directors of the Terran Council did not typically greet reassigned station commanders personally. Commander Voss. He looked less tired than the recording I had watched weeks earlier, though something in his eyes suggested the rest hadn't come easily. Thank you for coming on short notice. I wasn't given much notice to decline, Director. That earned the smallest flicker of something that might have been a smile, gone before it fully arrived. The Concord delegation specifically requested your presence in these talks. High Delegate Kaas's request, in fact, relayed through the VEF liaison office 3 days ago. That stopped me for a moment. Kaas asked for me. He did. I don't know his reasons. I suspect you may understand them better than I do, once you're in that room. Hale studied me for a moment. The careful, evaluating look I imagined he gave every officer he was about to ask something difficult of. You are not obligated to attend, Commander. Whatever happened in that assembly chamber 6 weeks ago, this council does not require your presence to negotiate on this planet's behalf. I know that. I straightened, feeling something settle into place that had been unsettled since the moment I'd watched Station 7's lights go dark behind me. I'd like to attend anyway. The negotiation chamber was nothing like the wide, tiered assembly hall where Kaas had once questioned my judgment in front of a dozen watching delegations. It was a plain, rectangular room, a single long table, Terran officials seated on one side and the Concord delegation on the other, arranged with none of the theater the assembly chamber had specialized in. There was no audience gallery. There was, I noted with some satisfaction, no weighted vote waiting to be tallied at the end of it, because Earth, for the first time in this entire account, was not the party asking anyone's permission for anything. Kaas sat near the center of the Concord delegation, and I watched him notice me the moment I entered, watched something pass briefly across his face that I recognized, because I had felt its exact shape myself 6 weeks earlier, standing in his chamber being asked to explain a decision that had saved lives. Commander Voss. He rose slightly, an unusual gesture from him, before settling back into his seat. I confess, I did not expect the Terran Council to grant my request quite this quickly. I'm here because I chose to be delegate, not because anyone granted anything. I took my seat beside Owen Hale, deliberately, and let that stand as the only answer I intended to give him about what had changed in 6 weeks. The talks began formally after that, and Kaas, to his credit, did not waste the room's time pretending this was anything other than what it was. He laid out the numbers plainly: 3 trade corridors lost, a 4th badly damaged, 4 Concord worlds now within active rating range for the first time in a generation, and Concord fleet losses in 6 weeks that had already exceeded 5 years of losses along the same line while it had been under Terran defense. I will not stand in this room and claim the Assembly's vote 6 weeks ago was correct, Kaas said, and several of his own delegation shifted uncomfortably at hearing him say it plainly, without the careful phrasing he had used in his own chamber. I underestimated what your commander's people actually provided along that line. I do not believe I was alone in that misjudgment, but I was the one who stood at the front of it, and I will not pretend otherwise in this room. It was not quite an apology. It was closer to an accounting, precise and uncomfortable in the way true accountings usually are, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did not need it to be more than that. What is the Concord Assembly asking for, specifically? Owen Hale asked. A full resumption of Terran defense duties along the Fenwall line, Kaas said, under whatever terms the Terran Council requires. Whatever terms. Hearing those two words, I knew exactly how much 6 weeks of losses had cost the argument Koss had once made so confidently in front of a full assembly chamber. Owen Hale did not answer immediately. He let the silence stretch long enough that I suspected it was deliberate, a small mirror of the silence the assembly had once let sit around me before Koss moved his motion. "The Terran Council is prepared to discuss resumption," Hale finally said, "but not on the same terms that existed before the withdrawal. If Earth returns to that line, it returns as a full and permanent partner in its defense, not a service the Concord budgets for and credits elsewhere when convenient." He laid out the terms plainly, the same way Koss had laid out the losses. Permanent, voting Terran seats on the Concord Assembly's Defense Committee, not advisory positions that could be procedurally silenced the way Vaughn had been silenced weeks earlier. A binding requirement that after-action reporting name every unit and every individual involved in an engagement, human or otherwise, with no language permitted that erased one species' contribution to inflate another's. Full command authority for Terran station commanders over Terran crewed stations, with no rotating co-command structure imposed without the Terran Council's direct consent. One member of the Concord delegation, an older Ushar official who had said nothing until that point, raised a measured objection. "The Defense Committee seats you are requesting would require amending the Assembly's founding charter on trade-weighted representation. That amendment alone could take a full cycle to ratify." "Then it takes a full cycle," Hale said. "We are not in a hurry that benefits from cutting that particular corner, Delegate. We were, until recently, given to understand that this assembly moves quite quickly when a motion serves the right block's interests. I trust it can move with equal speed when the motion serves fairness instead." The older Ushar official had no answer for that, and Koss, beside him, did not attempt to supply one either. Koss raised one point of his own. "The Fenwall line has been unguarded for 6 weeks, Director. The Skarn will not simply retreat because a treaty has been signed. Your forces will be returning to a line in a considerably worse position than the one they left." "We are aware," Hale said. "Commander Voss has already begun drafting a phased return plan with exactly that problem in mind. It will not be instant, it will be thorough, and it will hold once it is finished, the same way it held for 6 years before anyone in your assembly decided that holding wasn't worth respecting." I had not, in fact, drafted anything yet, though within the hour I had already begun sketching the outline of one on a borrowed datapad, because Hale's confidence in me was not the kind of thing I intended to let go to waste. And there was one condition Hale delivered more quietly than the rest, though no less firmly: a formal Concord memorial, entered permanently into assembly record, for every individual lost defending the Fenwall line under joint command, beginning with a name Hale read aloud without once looking down at a prepared note: Ellis Rowe. I had not braced myself for hearing that name spoken in that room, and it hit me harder than I expected, coming from someone who had never met him, in a room built for treaties rather than memory. I was grateful, in that moment, for every year of discipline that let me keep my composure while something in my chest quietly came undone. Koss was quiet for a long moment after Hale finished. "The Assembly will need to review the specific committee language," he said finally, "but I do not believe the delegation will oppose these terms. I would not oppose them myself." "Then we have a foundation to build from," Hale said. The formal drafting took the rest of that day and most of the next. Long stretches of careful language negotiated line by line. Less dramatic than anything else in this account, but no less important for being unhurried. I sat through most of it, offering input when asked, mostly listening, watching a document take shape that read less like the treaty language I had grown used to in Concord chambers and more like something built by people who had finally been forced to write down what they actually meant. It was during a break on the second day, in an out-of-the-way corridor away from the drafting room, that I found Vaughn waiting for me, upright but favoring one side carefully, the kind of careful movement that told me the medical station reports I had read hadn't exaggerated the injury. You're supposed to still be recovering, I said, feeling something loosen in my chest at the sight of Vaughn standing there at all. I discharged myself 2 days early. I have found, over the years, that recovery goes faster when there is something worth recovering for. Vaughn studied me for a moment. I asked to be included in the delegation once I was well enough to travel. I wanted to see this room in person. I'm glad you did. I meant it more plainly than I had meant almost anything else in 6 weeks. I read your message, the one that cut off. I know, I am sorry for the 11 hours that came after it. I understand now a little more of what that kind of silence cost the people waiting on the other end of it. How bad was it? I asked, nodding toward the careful way Vaughn still held one side. Bad enough that the medical staff argued with me for 2 full days before agreeing to let me travel. Bad enough that I will likely carry a reminder of it for the rest of my life. Vaughn said it plainly, without self-pity, the way Vaughn said most difficult things. I do not regret the outpost. I regret only that it took an injury like this one to make certain people understand what was actually at stake out there. I understand that better than I would like to, I said, thinking of Ellis Rowe, and of Toby's hull breach, and of every smaller cost this entire account had quietly asked people to carry. We stood together for a while, saying very little else, because some reunions do not need to be filled with words to mean everything they mean. Wren asked about you, I told Vaughn eventually. He was the one who first told me the outpost had fallen. He called me directly, outside every official channel, because he did not know who else still had a working line out there. Wren has always followed the manual too closely to admit when the manual has failed him, Vaughn said. I suspect calling you cost him something to do. I hope you told him that. I did. The final agreement was signed on the 3rd day, in a ceremony far smaller and far less theatrical than I imagine either side's history books will eventually make it sound. Owen Hale signed for the Terran Council, Koss signed for the Concord Assembly delegation, and I noticed, watching him do it, that his hand did not hesitate over the line the way I might once have expected it to. I returned to the Fenwall line 3 weeks later, not to Station 7 exactly, because the physical structure I had commanded for 6 years had been damaged too badly during the collapse to fully restore, but to a newly designated Station 7, built from salvaged infrastructure and new construction side by side, under a joint Terran Concord banner that for the first time in the history of that border actually meant what it claimed to mean. Daniel came back with me. So did Nora and Toby, fully healed and flying again, and a dozen others who had spent 6 weeks in reassignment postings wondering, the same way I had, whether any of it would ever truly go back to something worth returning to. Toby, standing on the new flight deck for the first time, asked me if we would be running the same weekly drills that had once drawn quiet complaints from Concord auditors. Every week, I told him, same as always. Only now, nobody gets to call it wasteful without a seat at the table to say so properly. Nora had the new manifest system running within the first hour, insisting, the moment she saw the Joint Command interface, that she was not going to spend another 6 years chasing down transfer paperwork that could simply be logged correctly the first time. Daniel spent that first afternoon walking the corridors much the way I once had on my last day here, except this time he was cataloging what needed fixing rather than what needed to be handed back to someone else. It was, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of homecoming none of us would have known how to ask for 6 weeks earlier, and exactly the kind we got anyway. Vaughn was there too. On the first day the lights came back on across the station's full length, standing beside me on the same observation deck where I had once watched those lights go dark, section by section, on my way out the door. It looks different, Vaughn said, watching the corridors light up in sequence. It is different, I said. I think that's the part that matters. I have told this account many times since, in briefings, in memorial services, in conversations with new pilots who ask what it was actually like out here before the terms changed. I have never quite found a way to make the whole of it sound as simple as it probably should. Peace, I have come to understand, was never the treaty itself, And it was never the vote that stripped my authority for a season. And it was not even the withdrawal that made an entire alliance finally understand what it had been standing on. Peace was always the 6 years of choices that came before any of that, made quietly, unpaid, and mostly unnoticed by people who kept showing up to a border nobody else wanted to hold. It was Ellis Rowe staying at his post for 90 extra seconds. It was Toby flying back with a cracked hull rather than not flying back at all. It was Daniel never once making me repeat an order, and Nora refusing to let a single overlooked detail slide, and Vaughn choosing, over and over, to tell me the truth, even when policy would have been easier. None of that ever showed up in a Concord bulletin. All of it is the entire reason any of this mattered enough to fight for. We did not burn anything down when we left. We simply stopped holding the roof up on our own and let everyone underneath it feel, for 6 long weeks, exactly how much weight it had actually been carrying all along. They know now. I do not know if they will always remember it as clearly as they do today, 5 months removed from the worst of it, but for now, the lights are on. The seats at that assembly table are finally ours by right, rather than by tolerance, and somewhere in the permanent record of a chamber that once tried to erase his name entirely, Ellis Rowe is remembered exactly as he deserves to be. That, more than any treaty line, is the part I still find myself grateful for. Every single day, I wake up back on this station, watching a border finally held the way it always should have been, together, and honestly, by choice.